Welcome back to our post-lunch session today. This morning, we listened to a very interesting lecture on, the idea of moral agency. We continue our engagement with moral philosophy. Let us, welcome Dr. Bhaskarjit Neog, who is from the for Philosophy at Jawaharlal University in New Delhi. Uh, Dr. Neog's research interests include social ontology, ethical theory and applied ethics, moral and political philosophy, etc. Recently he has published a book called What Responsibility, Whose Responsibility. So today Dr. Neog will be speaking on moral responsibility for historical injustice. So over to you, Dr. Neog.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nirmalida. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to come and join with this research forum. And thanks for wonderfully curating this forum. And I've heard a lot about it from my research students that it's going great. This afternoon, I'm going to make a presentation on moral responsibility for historical injustice.
Bhaskar,
Yes,
would
I'm.
it be possible to be a little louder so that
Yes,
we can
sure,
hear you?
sure.
Okay.
I'm going to uh, make it better. Yeah. So the topic is moral responsibility for historical injustice. I'll be speaking roughly for 50 to 55 minutes. And after that, I hope we'll have a Q&A session because that's very important. Without a Q&A session, philosophical deliberations will never be complete, I think. So particularly on this topic, I would definitely like to hear what you guys think about it. And this is a topic that I have not spoken before, although it is very much connected to what I have been doing of late. So there might be issues here and there. So please feel free to interject and do not hesitate to put me back on track if I go astray. Uh, I consider this topic to be a natural sequel to my manuscript, about which Nirmalida has just mentioned. And it came out last year, just a few months back from Routledge. And I haven't just discussed this issue in my book, but whenever I speak on collective responsibility, the theme of this book was collective responsibility. So that's what I'm talking about. Whenever I talk about collective responsibility, I invariably come across questions related to historical injustice, violence that took place in the past, violence committed by our ancestors, past generations, and so on and so forth, and our moral responsibility uh, for that. So this is an issue that is very closely related to this theme called collective responsibility. As I have said, I haven't really explored this in a systematic way. So this is my first attempt to do so. So let's see how it goes. So I want to begin with a video which has recently gone viral. This is actually it was about on a speech, actually, speech given by a an MP from New Zealand, and I think 21-year-old Maori MP, and her name is Hannah Rauiti Maipi Clark. So let's listen to this speech, which is of 45 seconds, and then we'll see. Yeah. So it's a very powerful act. To be able to do in a national parliament is not a joke. And the reason that the video has gone viral is that this act, this is basically what they call Maori Haka. It's a ceremonial war dance of the native Maori community. And this lady represents the community in the parliament. She actually performed this act to, but basically this is performed to welcome distinguished guests or to acknowledge great achievement or great occasions, and that's what they did. And by doing it, I think uh, she sort of made a very strong statement, a very courageous statement in the national parliament, and that is because these this is definitely not a mainstream part of the mainstream culture. She does it as a part of her struggle to get justice for the Maori community. Maori community is is I think the second largest Aboriginal communities in the New Zealand. Uh, so so because the mainstream New Zealanders, today's mainstream New Zealanders, once invaded and they came from Europe and they invaded the land in 19th century. So she made a very strong statement by performing that act. So this is the preface of this talk, and I hope it sets the platform for you to understand what I'm going to, or to get a sense what I'm going to talk about now. Uh, you know, there's a common sort of commonplace realization that officials or members of certain states, nations, corporations, chars, or ethnic groups uh, are likely to have acted in the past, which now we judge to be seriously unjust or wrong. Perhaps some of our ancestors were discriminated against, or some people were persecuted because of their color, their race, their gender, and some people were murdered, and they were murdered by our forefathers. And all this is done in the name of a group identity or a collective sentiment. And the fact that now we are able to recognize that violence, now that we are able to recognize the harm or the wrongdoing committed against the other community is something very, very important for our moral community at large. So uh, this is the issue that it raises these basic questions. If we are able to recognize the harm that was committed by our ancestors, then do the present members of our society have a duty to remember and to acknowledge those injustices? Shouldn't we feel then guilty or shame for what our forebears or predecessors did? And this is the same question. Aren't then we, in some sense, implicit in those crimes? Do we now not, as a descendants or successors, do we not then owe responsibility to the predecessor, to the descendants of these victims? So these are the questions. These are the basic questions that are raised when you talk about moral responsibility of historical injustice. Now, in this talk, I'm basically going to be targeting two objectives. The first one is to understand the normative implications of historic injustice. When we talk about historic injustice, what kind of normative implications, what kind of normative statements do they make to us and to the society at large? So that's the question that I'm going to be investigating. And the second task that I'm going to perform here is to address these implications through a concept of collective responsibility. Uh, there are different accounts of collective moral responsibility. But in order to understand, in order to sort of address the implications of historical injustice, whether what kind of account of collective responsibility do you need? That's something that I'm going to investigate. So, and when I talk about responsibility, I basically talk about moral responsibility. I'm not talking about other forms of responsibility, basically the moral responsibility. So the title of this talk is Moral Responsibility for Historical Injustice. So there are two concepts intertwined. These two concepts are quite interconnected. One is moral responsibility, then the other is historical injustice. Uh, uh, let's try to first understand what do we mean by historical injustice? What is historical injustice, and how this is to be understood in a systematic way? Because this is something that is out there in our public sphere. Everybody talks about injustice. Everybody talks about our ugly past. Everybody raises concerns or questions about our predecessors, right? Our wars and brutality that our previous generations experienced for other community for various reasons. You know, as this country actually in India, we suffer it. We keep talking about colonialism. We talk about British brutality. So whenever we talk about this, the concept of historical injustice pops in, and this is where we need to know what we mean by that. This is where we need to figure out how historical injustice needs to be understood. So it's basically an injustice, past injustice done by a powerful community to a less powerful community, put very simply, in simple terms. It refers to cases in which victims and the perpetrators of the justice are dead. They are no longer alive. So the issue is that the concept raises whether or and how the fact that an injustice is committed once by one group to another is still relevant in today's situation. So that's the issue. What kind of moral question, what kind of moral issue does it raise? So when you talk about the historical injustice, there are there are two communities. One is the victim community, the other is the perpetrators. Now they are no longer alive. Now we have the descendants. We have the descendants of the victims and the descendants of the perpetrators. So there are four communities that are being talked about or being referred to whenever we talk about moral responsibility of historical injustice. So, so this is the the technical side of any claim of moral responsibility of historical injustice, and this claim of moral responsibility is made with respect to the descendants of the perpetrators. So there are, as I said, there are tons and tons of examples before us. We talk about African Americans. This is, if you look at the literature, this is the community that is often talked about, and then the indigenous people of Australia and New Zealand. So they talk about the moral responsibility of the today's citizens in Australia and New Zealand for the crimes perpetrated against the aborigines. And for instance, victims of Jallianwala Bagh massacre. These are cases which we often come across. These are textbook cases. And then on a bigger level, colonialism as such, not in this part of the world, but across the world, everywhere colonialism was was a norm of the day those days. Now we all know the kinds of harm, the kinds of wrongdoings that colonialism as such was perpetrating, and then slavery, which is again quite a prominent case that the writers of this topic particularly talk about whenever they talk about the moral responsibility of today's American people, the slavery, particularly from the black community. And racism, whenever we talk about racism, it's everywhere. The racial attacks faced by non-white communities in white dominated areas. And in India, caste hierarchy. And this is quite commonplace in our public sphere, and autocratic rule and rulers. So there were harms, there are sort of wrongdoings, and it was pretty clear to us now, epistemically, it's very clear that this is not something that is acceptable now, even though the harms or the wrongdoings were committed centuries back. It's not easy. It's never easy to forget those the scars of those harms. And it's just because time has passed, there's a huge gap between the time that we are talking about and the time that we are living in. There's a huge gap that doesn't really make any difference to the moral statement that we are concerned about, because time is not an important fact to erase the memory, because the depth of these moral crimes or wrongdoings is so acute, and their implications are so very multifaceted that we cannot really evade them. We cannot really ignore them, and we do not know when they are going to be erased from our memory. Our successors, our next generation, people are in some sense are going to experience these. And this is something that we have seen how colonialism had impacted, how the colonial rulers' mentality, we often talk about these things in social sciences, still exist in our everyday life situations. And not to forget about Nazi genocide, Bhopal gas tragedy, Chernobyl disaster. These are typical textbook cases of historical injustice. So it's very, very important for us that we recognize this harm, that we recognize the depth of these harms and wrongdoings, and then we correct ourselves. It's not that we just epistemically aware of the harms and wrongdoings, but also the fact that we take certain because it gives us a lesson. It tells us something about our future acts. It gives us an occasion to think about, to be reflective about our present moral profile as a society, whether what we are doing now to other communities is something similar to what our ancestors did. So this is a huge learning experience for us, and it's not just a matter of remembering the past, but it's also about trying to learn what this ugly history teaches us for our future acts and behaviors as a community, as a society. And that's why these cases are very, very important. So this is in briefly about the idea of historical injustice, and this is the idea that you are going to get in the literature, and this literature that I'm talking about is not just literature produced by moral philosophers or political philosophers, but also by political theorists and critical theorists. So it's a very interdisciplinary area in a way, and it is deeply connected to political theory, and of course, for moral philosophers, this is extremely important to address. And this is in a way puts us because often this is something that we keep talking about. This is something that we often make reference to whenever we talk about crisis in the present day society. We talk about our past. We talk about um, 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 our you know uh, difficult times. But then, what do moral philosophers have to say about it? Whether if you look at the history of moral philosophy, whether we have enough uh, tools and techniques to address these problems, whether moral philosophers or philosophers as such have been able to design theoretical tools or techniques to deal with these concerns that we have in our everyday life situations. So, and the answer is not very sort of encouraging in a sense that whenever we talk about this, we talk about our obligation, our responsibility, our duties. But then, what kind of concept do we have in our philosophy textbook? Whether these concepts are able to take care of these concerns that we have in this area. I say the answer is not very encouraging because the concept of moral responsibility that we are familiar with as philosophy students is a very restricted concept. It's a very narrow concept, and it's a concept that is hardly able to do justice to the concerns raised by the issue of historical injustice. Now, of course, the concept of moral responsibility is uh, is very much a part of our textbook, moral philosophy textbook study. But then, what kind of concept is it? Whether this concept, the concept that we are familiar with, it's a it, it, it's the basic backbone of our ethical discussions. Now, the limitation of this concept that we have here is that it talks about an agency. And when you talk about moral responsibility, you talk about accountability, you talk about attributing moral responsibility to an agent for doing something, intentionally. So you have uh, a mental framework of an entity, and then there is an action, and then there are implications of that actions, and that is why you attribute moral accountability to an agent, right? So you have a flesh and blood, an individual human person who can be held morally accountable for doing or failing to do something morally relevant, right? Now, this concept, which is what I call textbook cases, is a very limited concept because it talks about an agent, it talks about intentional states, deliberation, or other factors related to the intentional makeup of the agent because of which a particular action, a morally aberrant action, is performed, and somebody suffered because of that. Now, this is where things become very complicated because when you talk about moral responsibility of past injustice or historical injustice, we don't have an agent out there, as it were, to 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 be able to shoulder the burden of moral responsibility, I declare. And there, we are not very sure about their intentional states. We are not sure about their mental makeup because of which they did what they did, right? So this is where the problem arises. So this concept, which is so sort of common and so familiar to us, is in a way handicapped. But anyway, so the idea is still the thing is that this concept has to be in a way understood in a particular way. Perhaps we'll be able to address the concerns of historical injustice if we start understanding the concept in a newer light, in a newer framework. And that's what this talk is all about. This is what I'm going to start now talk about. Now, when you talk about this textbook understanding of moral responsibility, it is often contrasted with something called causal responsibility, right? There are different. The word responsibility is very funny because it's used in variety of contexts. You say that the cold weather is responsible for the smoke in Delhi. So there you are using the word responsibility, but you are using it in the causal sense, right? When you say the government's ill thought out health policy is responsible for the extremely high number of casualties during the pandemic, in this sentence, again, you are using the term or the concept responsibility in a purely causal sense, but there are also a moral side to it, and that's something that is not highlighted by the meaning of this statement. So the causal side of it is equally very, very important. But when you talk about the moral dimension of the idea of responsibility, we're not just talking about the causal part, but we are also talking about something much more than that, right? So this is where it is very, very important because the causal connection is something which is going to create problems for us in in cases of historical injustice, because we may not be able to really sort of pinpoint the causal connection, as it were. We will probably not be able to figure out who exactly did those crimes. Whether our forefathers were really involved in those crimes, or those crimes were done in the name of our collective. So that causal connection is never clear. But when you talk about moral responsibility in the strict sense of the term, there's always a causal connection. And that causal connection is considered to be very, very paradigmatic, in the sense that an agent, it is held morally accountable for having done something morally significant or morally relevant. Now, the fact that the agent causes the outcome, and that is why it gives us an occasion to attribute moral responsibility to that action, and that's why it gives us the opportunity to put the blame on that individual, right? You can blame somebody only when you know that the person who is being blamed is the cause of the outcome for which you are now being morally concerned about, right? So blaming somebody necessarily, indicates a causal connection, and that causal connection is something that we don't really see in the case of historical injustice that we have in mind here. In the cases like this, it's not that they are not there, but it's very difficult to establish, because you were demanding the a moral statement from a community of people, and that community of people didn't do those violence themselves, only their predecessors did, right? Now, you are making a claim to these present generation that you ought to take responsibility for the actions of your previous generation. There is definitely a missing, there is no causal connection, right? Yet, there is a moral stance in it. there is definitely a moral side to it, because of which it does make sense to talk about the moral responsibility of the present generation for the actions and omissions of their previous generation. Now, this is something where things become very, very intricate, and it's very, very unclear. And this is the major problem for the writers to handle. So yeah, so causal responsibility is very, very important whenever we talk about concept of moral responsibility. There are other two important senses moral responsibility understood in the retrospective sense, and it is understood in the prospective sense. So when you hold somebody morally accountable for doing something or for having done something morally incorrect, you are using the concept in a retrospective sense, in the sense that the action has already been taken place, has already been committed, and that is why you are putting the blame on the individual, right? That's for the actions that have already taken place, right? So that is in a retrospective sense. Now, there is also this sense called prospective sense. You attribute moral responsibility for bringing out a certain state of affairs, desirable state of affairs. For instance, you are holding a parent morally responsible for giving good education to their children. You are holding me morally accountable for doing the right thing as a citizen. So this is in the prospective sense. So in this sense, it's a duty, it's obligation, it's futuristic, right? It's a responsibility in the futuristic sense in comparison to the retrospective sense, which is backward looking. So backward looking and forward looking, these two senses are very closely interconnected, and this interconnection is going to be very, very crucial for our understanding of moral responsibility for historical injustice. And that's why I'm introducing these two senses. Now, there's something, the last point is something that I have already said, that the concept of moral responsibility that we have in our understanding as a philosophy student is something which is restrictive in the sense that it is always understood within the framework of individualism, and it's an individualist construct. It's individualist construct because here it is believed that there is an agent, and the agent has certain intentional states or mental makeup because of which the agent did something, right? And then that makes that's why the individual ought to be held morally accountable. Now, the fact that there are cases of collective action, there are cases of collective wrongdoings. Historical injustice are typical cases of collective wrongdoing. We don't talk about a particular ruler's bad action or immoral action. We talk about, when you talk about historical injustice, we talk about collective harms. We talk about the crimes that are committed in the name of collectives. Now, if we have the concept of moral responsibility in this individualist framework, we will probably not be able to handle them in an efficacious way, in the sense that either it's going to be too reductive because the actor is not one individual, right? The actor is a collective actor, as it were. It was a community, it was a group, it was a society, it was a government or a nation. They are not individuals, but they are conglomeration of different varieties of individuals. generations of people were involved in forming those collectives. Now, whether this concept, which is what which I call the received understanding of individual, received understanding of moral responsibility, and whether this concept will be able to really tackle the this sort of cases, uh, and that is the question. Because if you look at the history of moral philosophy, it's always about individuals. It's always about individuals' beliefs, desires, intentions, so on and so forth, and the blame and praise ought to be attributed to them individually because it is their act, individual acts. We don't talk about collective acts as such, right? And this is something that is quite commonplace, not just about moral responsibility, but also about consciousness, also about other mental states, other concepts, which are always within the framework of individualism. And this is where the problem lies. So our immediate task is to collectivize some of these concepts, perhaps. And this is something that I'm doing here when I'm addressing the issue of historical injustice. Now, uh, so when you talk about moral responsibility for historical injustice, what we have, the problem that we have is that we do not really know who and how we are required to go about them, right? Whether we are actually because it doesn't really make sense to blame or to go on blaming our ancestors, blaming those people, those rulers who did wrongful acts. But yet, it seems that it is very, very important that we do that because holding somebody morally accountable or morally responsible is not equivalent to scolding them or not equivalent to shouting at them. You're not really making a plain accusation just for the heck of it. Just because we do not know who did that, you are making a wholesale moral claim about a particular community, about a group. That's not your purpose because you are sure that this is something that is done in the name of a group, and that gives us the opportunity to see things in proper framework. We need to really identify who that agent is, what that entity is all about. So the important thing is to acknowledge first. The acknowledgement is important, and acknowledgement is equivalent to taking responsibility for the past injustice, or to at least to say that yes, that did take place, and these are the people who were involved in that action, right? You can give all kinds of excuses and alibis. Why did they do that? What are the compulsions they had, so on and so forth. That can go on and on. But the fact that they did it and whatever they did was something that is unacceptable is very, very important to note. And this is why it is crucial for us to understand that acknowledgement is the first step. And the second important thing when you talk about moral responsibility of historical injustice is to recognize that such and crime, and this is something that such and such crimes were committed by this entity. And by this entity means that this entity is not a very sort of well-defined entity, as it were. Unlike these certain states or nations, it's not never well-defined. It's always a problematic concept. But when you recognize that the reparation for injustice is involved, and then you have issues about compensation that we talk about. But these are things that are not necessary. These are things that don't necessarily follow. The compensation is probably the last thing that people talk about. The first step is to recognize the fact that such and such thing happened. Anyway, so but then this concept of historical injustice and the moral responsibility for historical injustice is it sort of, it has lots of problems, and that is why philosophers of individualist persuasion find it extremely objectionable to talk about it in the first place. They just don't accept it, that it makes sense to talk about the moral responsibility for past injustice or historical injustice. They don't really recognize it. And when I talk about in the philosophers of individualist persuasion, what I mean by that is basically the libertarian individualist, right? And if you look at the history of moral philosophy, it's not just the libertarian individualists, but all kinds of individuals, normative individualists, methodological individualists. They're ostensibly against this idea of moral responsibility for historical injustice. They think that it's just not possible, right? So here I am actually going to highlight four, or actually five major objections that they raise against the possibility of historical injustice as a coherent moral concept, or the fact that they, even if there's something called historical injustice, it doesn't really have any moral import. It doesn't have any moral significance. And that's the argument that they put forward. So the first one is about how do you fix the issue of responsibility when the target or the subject of responsibility is not very clear to us. As I say, when you talk about generations, when you talk about our predecessors, so these are categories which are not well defined, right? Uh, these are categories which are very, very fluid, because there's no fixed term given to a particular population to be called a generation, right? And when you talk about, let's say, uh, the colonizers, and there's not just one generation of people. They ruled, for instance, this country for 200 years. Millions of people were involved. Who are you actually going to hold morally accountable? Who are you actually pointing fingers at, right? The generations of people were involved. They began, it was a profession for them. Some of the greatest philosophers were also part of, holding high positions in the East India Company, right? How are you going to sort of really talk about that entity? Because it's important to really define the target. When the moment you are talking about a moral, making a moral claim, you need to define the target. Now, how are you going to define the target of a generation? It's very unclear, it's very fluid, just not possible for us to tell that these are the people who were responsible. Just doesn't make sense. Or this is how what they claim. So that's the first objection, because they don't have these entities or the society, community. These are fluid concepts. They don't have any well-defined or straight boundary. That's the first argument that is leveled against the possibility of the normative implication of historical injustice. The second one is again very, very important. It suggests that injustice may be often superseded if enough time passes, right? You can't keep on talking about historical injustice. How long are you going to go on doing that? There has to be a time where it should stop, right? For instance, descendants of colonialists may over time become attached to colonized land. Now, are you going to say that, and for instance, they now consider this land as their land. Now, how are you going to then put the blame to somebody who has who identifies herself as the son of the soil, as it were, right? Uh, it just doesn't make sense, right? And the time matters. How long are you going to go on talking about the injustice, as I say? So it's wrong to suggest that the descendants are themselves wrong. You might say that their predecessors were wrong, but to make the moral claim um, against the descendants is something that's not an immediate sort of implication, and that's where the problem lies. It's not very clear. It's really there has to be a time where it should stop, right? So this is another important argument. The third argument is that there's something called non-identity problem. It's basically talked about with reference to the Black community and those people who talk about the non-identity problem, they take recourse to people like Derek Parfit. So the argument goes like this, that the descendants of the original victims would not have been born had it not been for the injustice itself. For instance, the African Americans who descend from the original slaves, they probably they, their existence would be a big question mark. If slavery didn't take place, probably they would not have been there in the first place. Whatever life that they are having now, whatever life they are now leading, it's definitely better than its non-existence, as it were. The fact that they are now living in one of the most prosperous countries says that this is possible because slavery was possible. Because of this, because of the fact that their forefathers were slaves, and the fact that that was the reason for their birth, and that's why to talk about their past injustice just doesn't make sense. So their existence is the problem. So this is something called non-identity problem. It's particularly raised with respect to slavery in the context of America. The fourth argument, which is very interesting, and which is what I'm going to be talking about in the last part of my lecture. How much time do I have, Nirmalika?
Uh, you can continue till quarter to four.
Okay.
So almost half an hour.
Yeah. I hope it's going fine, if I may ask.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah. Please let me know if there are sort of issues and concerns. Okay, so just I'm talking about the issue of collective responsibility. When we talk about moral responsibility, we are talking about the responsibility of a bunch of people or a group of people or a society as such. And this is precisely the problem. It's just very difficult to really establish collective responsibility case here, because there's this problem that nothing persists. It's just the actors. I mean, it makes sense to hold a corporate entity for doing something morally illegal in the recent past when you have enough evidence. But many a time, what happens is that when you talk about past injustice or historical injustice, we don't have adequate evidence. Often they are dependent on narrative, their oral sort of explanation or expositions, and uh, uh, we don't have enough proof about a bunch of people, about a group of people. that they actually did something like this. Unlike cases like Jallianwala Bagh mass massacre, there were proofs. We know who did it, right? Now, and the idea here is that the question of agency doesn't really the agency doesn't really persist over a period of time like that, right? So there's no agencyal inheritance, as it were. Today's Britishers definitely do not inherit their ugly past. For instance, suppose you go and make this claim in the British Parliament that you did this ugly thing in the state of Punjab, today's Punjab, and this is absolutely Ivorian and you must apologize for it. The problem is that it just doesn't make sense. They would say that, well, that's fine, that was bad, that happened, but what can we do? We didn't do that. There was no consent. We don't agree with those sort of with those sentiments. So this is another problem that the individualist will pursue against the possibility of moral responsibility for historical injustice. The last one is about it's called redundancy thesis. Redundancy thesis suggests that there are theories of distributive justice. There we have enough of it. The last part of the 20th century, if you look at the history of the last part of the 20th century, moral and political philosophy, it's all about distributive justice. So you have Rawls, theory of justice, justice as fairness, various forms of egalitarianism that we have, and then the various versions of utilitarianism. So they all talk about historical injustice in some sense or the other. Why do you need to talk about moral responsibility for historical injustice in a newer framework? Because distributive justice takes care of some of these concepts. So that's another argument, which is what they call redundancy argument. Redundancy says that this claim, this claim for moral responsibility for historical injustice, just it doesn't make sense because enough has been said and done. The moment you have a good theory of distributing resources on various grounds which are morally justified and on competitive ground, then you have made your case there with that thesis itself, and you do not really need another argument, a newer argument to talk about the moral injustice of the by the past generation, because we talk about equal distribution of resources. That's another. So I'm going to briefly, I'm not going to really talk about against each one of these arguments, but each one is really, really very powerful. Briefly, I'll comment on them, and this is how my responses go. The first is that even though such entities, remember, the first entity was about that it's a fluid concept. It doesn't have its in a boundary, in a well-defined boundary. So the idea is that even though such entities are not very well defined, their existence or presence can never be ruled out. Think about the concept like stack of hay, or when you say bunch of standby or passers-by or a group of audience. They are, although not very strictly speaking well defined, but they do have an existence. They do have an epistemic existence. They do have a moral existence. So to say that these ideas like generations or our predecessors, these are fluid categories, just doesn't work, because we have ways and means to understand what they mean. And it's very important for us to talk about when you know that they exist and they do have an epistemic status, it definitely makes sense to talk about their moral status, right? So that's the first response. Second is that scars of justice just do not disappear like that. Just because time has passed doesn't mean that uh, the moral depth of the problem disappeared with time, right? And that's why I said it's never too late to let your victim know that this was wrong on your part. Never too late, right? So we talk about injustices took place in epic stories, right? Why do that? Because the moral scar is so deep, it just doesn't disappear. Even though it is in fiction, it makes sense to talk about it because it has a lot of things to give us newer information and to help us make better citizens, better society. So, yeah. So the third, very quickly, I'm sort of presenting my responses here. The third argument is that uh, uh, I think it's not a very good argument, although they do get support from people like Buffett, Buffett's famous writings on population ethics, how utilitarianism was defended. Now, that people's existence matters and they matter to us ethically speaking. They definitely have a moral value. The fact that they exist, even if their life may be really not at all you know uh, good, yet the fact that they exist makes sense to us morally, and that is good for them as well. So this is in a way not a very good argument to say that you would not have existed if that slavery didn't took place. It's actually really an ugly argument, I would say. The thing is that probably one should say if slavery didn't take place, probably their life, the life of the future generation would have been better than what it is now. For now, if you say that, well, you Indians are having a decent lifestyle because Britishers were there, to say that is, I would say, it's an awful argument to say that because they exploited us, and that's why we have learned how to be resilient about our issues. That's a wrong argument. It's wrong because one could say that that probably things would have been much better because economically India was much better before British rule, right? Things would have been much better. Why to think other way around? So that's not a good argument to say that you know uh, to say that this slavery it's a mistake to keep on talking about the past injustice. And the fourth is about collective agency problem, and that's something that I'm going to talk about now. The fifth one is the thesis. This is again something that I don't really agree because the equal distribution of resources, I would say, says very little about the recognition of the moral depth. It's just one dimensional. It really doesn't take care of a hell lot of other things. It's not always about resources. It's not always about monetary benefit, right? It's about the recognition of the wrongdoing that was done by the majority over the minority. Anyway, now to so these individualists, and that's the individualist arguments against the possibility of moral responsibility for historical injustice. They don't really have any strict objection against the idea of collective responsibility. They can talk about it because they have an individualist construal of collective responsibility, right? Uh, but then their main argument is that it's just not possible and it doesn't make sense because one can be held morally accountable only for an action in which see participated directly. And that's what we learned from the received understanding of moral responsibility, as I have been talking about right from the beginning. That's the textbook explanation that we gather, whether from Aristotle or from others, in fact, including Strawson. That's the idea that we gather. A person can be held morally accountable only for the action in which he participated or which he brought it up, right? One can be held responsible only to the extent that her contribution caused the harm. Even if you accept the collective responsibility, the responsibility claim can be made only to the extent of her contributing a particular portion of the harm that took place at the collective level. Since no contemporary, and this is the libertarian individualist, no contemporary citizen participated in past injustice, directly caused those harms like slavery, the contemporary citizens cannot be held morally responsible for that because they didn't do it. So again, going back to our received understanding of moral responsibility, the received theory of moral responsibility, this is quite right because there's no intention. So you are making a moral claim about your predecessors and about the fact that you now ought to apologize as people just doesn't make sense because there was no intention. You didn't participate. You didn't know. You just happened to be born in that community. How are you going to really then make sense of those moral claims? So this libertarian claim actually is pretty strong, but then it's something that can be resisted. And this is where I come. That for them, collective responsibility is a collection of individual responsibility. And they would say that individuals are required to bear responsibility for collective wrongdoings to the extent their contributions cause the wrongdoing in the creation. And the individualists, this is at their best when they say that when you talk about collective responsibility, you'll have to talk about how it matters at the individual level. When you say how it matters at the individual level, you will invariably distributing responsibility to the individual members of that collective, right? So it boils down to individualism. So collective responsibility for an individualist or a libertarian individualist is just a collection of individual responsibility. Now, this is something that is not acceptable to me, or so I argue that it's possible to come up with a collectivist construct of collective responsibility because it's possible to talk about collective responsibility as collective's responsibility or the collective responsibility per se, collective responsibility per se, and to be able to make that claim, collective responsibility as collective's responsibility, it's very important for us to first talk about a collective agent, a set of collective intentional states. There's something called collective emotional states, because when you talk about the concept of the collective moral agency, it's not the rational part that is important. There is also an emotional part which is equally very, very important. And this is something that we learned from people like Strawson, because the emotional side is equally very, very crucial for understanding the moral profile of an individual human person, right? Now, if we want to talk about the possibility of collective moral agency to be able to shoulder the burden of a collective, then we should be able to talk about collective intentional states first, then collective agency proper second, then the third is that we need to talk about collective emotional states like collective shame, collective guilt, collective remorse, so on and so forth. These are things that I'm not going to talk about here, but important thing for here to note here is that yes, we do talk about collective agency, or we do use the concept of collective agency in our everyday practice all the time, even though we may not have a very legitimate, very strong thesis about it. I mean, it wasn't there because there are a lot of people, philosophers, of particularly analytic tradition, because the majority of them would say that it's just not possible to talk about collective agency proper, because to, to be able to say that, you'd be subscribing to something like collective mind, which is a mythical concept. It just doesn't make sense. It's a flowery thing. It's just metaphorical idea. It doesn't have any ontological status, so on and so forth. But when you talk about collective agency proper, there are people, a lot of interesting, theses have been proposed in recent times. People like Christian Lees, Philip Pettit, and Margaret Gilbert, Timur Raimela, and many others have proposed the possibility of an agency which is shared, which is collective, which is non-individual. And I think we do have a good reason to suggest that yes, that's there in our practice, even though we do are not ready to admit them at the theoretical level, because we do talk about states, corporations, churches as moral agents in the way that individual human persons are treated, in the way that individual human persons can be held morally accountable. We hold these entities morally accountable for doing or having done something. And also, we hold them morally, futuristically responsible for bringing about a certain desired uh, states of affairs. We hold churches to be responsible for any claim that is made with respect to sentiments about abortion, for instance. Christian churches, we keep talking about the corporations. They have moral responsibility to take care of the environment and so on and so forth. Now, the moment you do that, the moment you meaningfully try to do that, you invoke a moral agency in some sense. And because this will take another talk to talk about collective agency, because that's an entirely different thing, and far more sophisticated than this. So I'm just assuming that this is possible, and this is there in the literature. So it makes sense to have a collectivist construct of collective responsibility. Now, there are two objections that I want to highlight towards the end. And the first is that the individuals can only have this responsibility if they are complicit in the wrongdoing. They are only complicit if they actually participated, or if they authorize those individuals act in their name. Present citizens don't authorize past officials to act in their name. So that's the first objection that can be leveled against even the collectivist construct of collective responsibility, not just the individualist construct of collective responsibility, but the collective construct of collective responsibility will also face these two objections. And this is the first one. The second one is that the present collective is not identical to the collective that existed in the past, and therefore the present citizens cannot be expected to take responsibility for the wrongdoing of the past. And these are the response that I have. Being complicit is not the only way in which individuals can obtain responsibility in respect to the past. They can be legitimate candidate by being part of an organization that is understood to have long-term contracts, debts, and other enduring responsibilities. And the practical cases suggest that if someone is the director of a corporation, he or she takes the responsibility of paying debts incurred by the former decision makers. And this might include, even in cases of German corporations, they were made to pay fine for what their predecessors did, responsibility for making compensation for past wrongdoing. So it's not necessarily that complicit is the only way in which a question of responsibility can be talked about. Not necessarily. You may not have taken part in those acts. You may not have any given consent to those wrongdoings. Yet the fact that you inherit certain things, there's something called positional status. Your moral profile suggests that you have connection with the entity, with that identity. That is good enough to talk about your moral responsibility. The other one is about the objection is about whether the state's identity as moral agents persists. And this is something which is fascinating, and I think I'm quite right here because this allegation is just not good enough. When you say that the agents don't persist, the collective agents, kind of collective agents that we are talking about, they don't exist or they don't persist over a period of time. Like when you talk about long 200 years colonial rule, it's just not possible to talk about one British a collective agent that was responsible for all these wrongdoings because it just today's British nationals don't even share that identity, share that agency in a way. And how are you going to then really make sense of? It's just two separated by time. Just make it doesn't make sense. So here there is a those who are familiar with personal identity would be able to give us a really an efficacious answer to this. But this is how it goes. If doubts can be cast with about whether a human individual was the same person at an early stage of his life as he is now, when his interests and characteristics, mental and physical, have significantly changed, then it should be at least as easy to raise questions about whether a political society counts as the same moral essence now as it was 100 years ago. So if that is something that is possible with respect to human person, flesh and blood human person, why not in proportion to that, why not extend it to the collective agents living across different time phases and to talk about its status epistemologically and morally. So that's the rebuttal that can be launched. Now, taking responsibility, not just, as I said right in the beginning, not just about giving compensation or giving monetary benefit to the descendants, it could well be a symbolic act. And this is something very, very important. So these are the four cases and examples that I have come across, and uh, they say a lot about it, the symbolic act that I'm talking about. In 1908, National Sorry Day emerged in Australia after the release of a government report titled Bringing Them Home about the stolen generation of Aboriginal citizens in Australia. 2008, the Australian Prime Minister apologized to Aborigines for past injustice inflicted on them. Shortly after that, the Canadian Prime Minister apologized to Indigenous people for past government action that placed their children in Christian boarding school with the intent of assimilate them. And then the US House of Representatives passed a resolution apologizing for slavery and Jim Crow in the summer of 2008, while state legislature in Alabama, Maryland, and North Carolina all issued apologies for slavery. So these are things that do take place. It's just that we need to know how, whether we are really ready enough to understand the depth of these issues as a society, as a community. The first is the acknowledgement, and the second is to go out and tell the world that yes, this is something that happened in the name, in our name, in our name. And this is something that's now in days the campaign that not in my name is something that is going on. This is somewhat similar. So identity matters. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Neog. I mean, this is an issue that does not only concern professional philosophers. It's an issue that members of a larger society also do talk about. So thank you very much. So now after this very very interesting and thought-provoking discussion, um, our participants might have any questions or comments or clarifications to ask for. So please come forward.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi. Hi.
Yeah. My question is, besides causal, moral, and socio-political point of view, can we have an economic point of view of historical injustices? Like the Britishers looted billions of pounds from India and historically highly important artifacts and antiques from India, and they haven't returned this to India till now. So, at a diplomatic level, compensation must be made, and at first it should be made. So, what's your opinion on this?
Uh, a lot depends, as I said, how strong your evidences are, probably. Of course, there's one thing that the Kohinoor was looted, and it was now there in the British Museum. You can make a claim about it. That's very, very specific. That kind of cases are very specific, probably. And you can definitely make if that makes it an economic statement. But as such, I would say these are two different things, because, as I said, when you talk about moral responsibility, it's not moral responsibility taking in its spirit is not necessarily a claim about monetary or financial or material benefits. It, at the moral level, at the metaphysical level, whether you are able to pass a moral judgment impactfully, that's what matters. It is
Okay.
immaterial whether you are going to get benefited by that. It's a
Okay.
different thing altogether.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
compensation is a different statement altogether. First and foremost, whether you are able to uh, get a proper ground, a moral ground at the metaphysical level to be able to make that moral statement forcefully is important. And that is something which we as moral philosophers try to do first. The other things, I think there are other better people to talk about. Policymakers are there,
Yes. Thank you,
politicians.
sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Any other question?
Yes, sir. I do have a question.
Yeah. Please
Uh,
go ahead.
Sir, I'm not sure if it is within the scope of the presentation, but I was just wondering how we define what a historical injustice is. Like a community might claim that they were at the receiving end, but the community who perpetrated that, they might deny it, or it might happen that somebody, it's a very contentious issue. So one community did something and the other community retaliated and they did something. So I mean, how we place moral responsibility in that situation?
Okay, let me ask you uh, a question, which probably will give you a good reason to think why it is important to think about in that fashion. Suppose you say that there's no good evidence, right? It's all
No,
about thinking, or there may not be good evidence, and because if one community makes a claim about the other community is also well in their rights to make a separate claim, a different claim, right? Now, that's a different problem altogether, isn't it? But to say that it doesn't exist, that definitely doesn't say anything that it didn't exist or it doesn't exist. And definitely not all cases are like that. Of course, there are claims and counterclaims, right? But then the fact that such things did happen, to say that slavery didn't happen or wasn't there would be a monstrous mistake. To say that caste hierarchy wasn't there in the Indian subcontinent would be preposterous to claim, isn't it? To say that Jallianwala Bagh was just a imagination of Indian people to take benefits from the colonizers would be even worse, right? So it's probably would be wrong to paint everything in the same brush, but yes, I do agree, there are cases where things become uh, uh, very vague, When there is a counterclaim, particularly when there is a counterclaim, things become very big. And when it happens between two tribal groups, it happens, right? But those are different cases, I think. They have to be tackled differently. But if somebody's epistemic status not uh, is not well placed or not very also it depends how you are going to take, whether suppose this is something that you would come across in epistemic violence. You say, suppose the Black community makes a claim that this is something that was done to us, our women were raped, our mothers and our grandmothers were raped, brutally murdered, mutilated, and now you don't accept that because this claim is being made by a Black woman, right? Because you are not giving that epistemic status to that woman because it is coming from her, so it cannot be true. Because it is coming from a Dalit woman, it cannot be true, right? This is what we call epistemic injustice. You do not consider the other as a legitimate truth, uh, maker, or claim about truth is not true. You don't, because there is a deficit of reliance. You don't really rely, or you are not ready to accept. There's something called hermeneutical injustice when you talk about epistemic violence, epistemic injustice. You talk about hermeneutical injustice. You also talk about this form of injustice. Yeah, so that's a different thing altogether. But to say that it didn't exist or it doesn't exist, that we have less evidence or contentious evidence, to say that that's a good ground to not to talk about it is not a good ground, I'd say. Yeah.
Yes, sir, I do agree. That's why I said that I'm not sure if it is within the scope of the presentation. Uh, but I was thinking in terms of like what happened with the Babri Masjid demolition and this issue between Muslims and Hindus, and then they did something, and then they claim that earlier it was done something. So in such cases, or what's is happening in Israel, Gaza, and Hamas. So I mean, in that cases, there is other side claiming. So I was just wondering what it would look like, or how what should be counted as historical injustice, or like.
Yeah.
Is there any criteria?
No,
So I was thinking in that terms, but yes.
you're right. This, moral claims are always like that. It is immaterial whether there was any proof when you had stolen that pen from me, from my office. Well, there was anyone out there to be able to detect you. But the fact that you did it was good enough reason for you to feel bad about it, right? Whether we have good evidences against each other is immaterial, because at the moral level, at the metaphysical level, the harm was done, even though there was nobody to witness it, even if there is no evidence against each other. The fact that it did happen. So that's why moral claims are not always about the other. It's also about yourself. You can hold yourself morally accountable for doing something, even though there was no one to detect that what you did was wrong, right? So the range of moral claims, it operates at a very different level where evidences are immaterial. Evidences are important and proofs are important, but they are not necessary for a moral claim to sustain.
Thank you so much, sir. It was helpful.
Yeah.
Any other question? This is a very, very, very interesting, and it really, forces us to raise many important issues. As I said, concern not only a professional philosopher but also, you know, uh, ordinary human beings. We do talk about historical injustice, and we do talk about, ascribing moral responsibility for those injustices, and so on. So, I mean, there are many, many, issues and questions and clarifications that one could, ask for.
I think they're tired.
Okay. Well, then, again, once again, thank you very much, Dr. Neog. As usual, I mean, your lecture was so lucid and so detailed and so interesting. So thank you very much, Bhaskar, for joining us today and for your presentation.